Hello everyone! So in a previous video we installed a new radio for our Nissan Frontier, and this new radio came with this awesome reverse camera. Now unfortunately this truck doesn't have one on there, so we're going to go through the steps of how to install it from scratch. And it's going to turn out looking like this, which turned out really looking good, as well as it functions perfectly. So let's go ahead and get started. So where we left off on the previous video, we went ahead and tucked in that reverse camera cable under the dash just for the time being. So let me go ahead and try to grab it, and there we go. And as you can see, it's still bundled up, and it's got plenty of slacks for us to go ahead and make this run. So we're going to go along this trim right around the driver's side, go all the way up, and then we're going to go to the back. We got to remove this back panel here where these seats are. So all this right here needs to come out. And then let me go ahead and make my way to the outside of the truck. And then it's going to come out through a little grommet on the outside corner. And then it's going to go down, around, and along the driver's side of the frame, all the way to the back to the rear bumper right here. And it's pretty much, that's the plan of how we're going to run it. So for our very first step, let's go and remove the front kick plate. Now this one's pretty easy. All you need is a trim wheel tool and start prying upward. Now some of you may not even need this. You could probably do it with your hands because this one was pretty flimsy and it looked like it took some wear and tear over time. But we'll just go ahead and set that aside. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing on the rear kick plate as well. Again, once you pry it up a little bit, you should be able to get with it with your hands. There we go. And that pops right off. Now, for some of you may have noticed, there is an extra blue cable for my Nissan Frontier. Once upon a time, I went ahead and installed this to install an inverter so I can have it in the back seat. But I went ahead and took all that out and took out the fuse, just so that way I can go ahead and go through this video without that being in the way. So, moving on, let's go and remove the seat base trim panel, and this is going to be for both the rear seats. And this pops right out as well, but you can use a trim removal tool if you need one. And then we'll go ahead and set that aside, and we'll go ahead and go to the other side. Now, I have Velcro here, because unfortunately, it does that. And these are just old, so unfortunately they just fall down, so that's what the Velcro's for. But while I'm holding it up, let's go ahead and remove that trim as well. And I'm going to go ahead and pry it from one end, and then it should pop right off. There we go. So now let's go ahead and pick up the camera, that way you can see what I see. So we have one bolt right there, and one right there. And those are going to be the two that we're going to focus on next. So let's go ahead and grab our 14mm socket and socket wrench, and let's go and remove the cushion bolts. And once again, a nice little spot, give it a nice turn, and it should break loose. And there we go. So we got one right there. I'm going to go to the other side, that way I'm not in the way. I'm going to loosen this one up as well, and there's the second one. And we're going to lift up and then out. And that cushion came right out, that's pretty good. So now let's go ahead and lower the camera, go ahead and zoom in, so we can focus on that seat back assembly bolt. And we're going to need a 10mm socket and socket wrench, and we'll go ahead and loosen this up. And almost there. Should be able to get the rest by hand. And there we go. We'll go ahead and set that aside. Then we'll bring the camera back out. And all we have to do is lift upward. And it comes out that easy. And the reason being is because there's two hooks right there. And then goes holes in the back and they slide downward. So we'll go ahead and set that aside. Now we'll go ahead and repeat the exact same steps on the driver's side. Pretty much take the seat out. Zoom in. Take that one bolt out for the back seat assembly. Lift up. And there we go. Next, let's go and remove the jack storage cover. It's basically one lock and it folds down. Now there's also one little string basically tying down at the bottom, so it's in a loop. All we gotta do is take that off as well. And we'll go ahead and set that aside. And we'll also go ahead and remove the tire iron as well as the jack, just so that way it's not in our way later on. Now this step is optional, but let's go and remove the child seat anchor cover. If not, I'll probably end up losing it. Next, let's go and remove our headrest. So I'm gonna start by pulling it upward. There we go, it's locked in. Then let's go and press on the lock or the latch and continue lifting upward. And there we go. And I'll do the same thing on the driver's side as well. And there's the second one. So now let's go ahead and grab our trim wheel tool and remove these Christmas tree push pins. So there's one, and there's 2, 3, and 4. Okay, now let's go to the other side, do the same thing. So there's 2, 3, and 4. So now we should be able to pry away our rear panel. Give a nice little tug. And a little bit high. All right, starting to break loose little by little. Go ahead and work my way around the edges. Go to the other side, do the same thing. And it's prying apart, it just requires a little bit of brute force. And go to the top. There we go. Now I also like to point out there's headrest guides I'm pulling up the top here. These usually twist out, but it's just easier just to pull them out for the first get-go. And there we go, that's what they look like. Now we'll go and take this panel and slide it right out the truck. So now that we got that big panel out of the way, let me go and zoom in. And this is the area we're going to focus on running our cable. So we'll go and take a trim wheel tool and see if we can remove this plug. Now get under the edge, pry. And that came out pretty easy. It's just a little plastic plug, there's nothing much to it. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of room to work, so let me go ahead and remove this rear lower finisher. And same thing, all you have to do is basically get a grip on it and just pry it outward. And a little bit more. And there we go. And we're not breaking anything, we're just basically removing the clips from the truck. And right there is the hole we're going to focus on, so all I'm going to need now is basically to find a grommet that will fit. So I have this grommet kit, pretty easy, pretty cheap. And from what I found, it looks like a 7/8 is going to work pretty well. And for those of you who may not know, we're using a grommet because we don't want our cables vibrating against a sharp edge. So now that we have all the panels removed, now let's go ahead and start running the cable. So I'm going to start by removing the screw that's right under the dash where the steering column is, just so I can actually pry away this one little trim panel. And I'm going to go ahead and tuck this cable around it. Basically, I'm just hiding it along the way. Go ahead and put that one screw back in because I no longer need to keep it loose. And I want to keep feeding the wire all the way around. And I want to give myself plenty of slack because I don't ever want to go ahead and strain this or basically put too much tension on it. I want to go ahead and run it along the bottom. And it is a little tough since I do have a power wire there, but we still had a little bit of room. Go ahead and feed that through. Okay, so far so good. Let's work our way to the back, do the same thing. And we'll feed that through that one little plastic area. Okay, looks pretty good. And now let's go ahead and bring it towards the back, and I'll put it all into this carpet. Alright, so that was pretty quick and easy. Now let's go ahead and feed that one cable or the wire basically through the grommet. We're going to basically pre-feed it. And after about 20 feet later, now let's go ahead and feed that cable through the hole. And again, it's about 20 feet at least. And that's about enough right there. So we go ahead and bring the camera in just a little bit, and now let's go ahead and grab our loom tubing. And we're basically going to run a little bit on the inside of the vehicle and the rest of it on the outside. So I'm going to feed a little bit through the hole. And I'm under the vehicle right now doing this, so bear with me. And that's enough slack on the inside so I can pull a little bit inward. And all I'm going to do is just feed the wire right in this loom tubing. There's basically a crease or basically a slit that goes along it. And once I got enough of it in there, I went ahead and just put the rest of the slack under the truck. Now let's go ahead and install our grommet. And let me zoom in a little more, that way you can see what I see. And almost there. A little bit tight, but that's good. And there we go. So far it looks pretty good, almost looks factory. So I have plenty of slack right there. Now let's go ahead and apply some sealant. Now the whole reason I'm doing this, because one, I just want to keep this somewhat waterproof, as well as this will minimize a little bit of vibration. And that looks pretty good. So we'll go ahead and zoom out. Now let's go ahead and reinstall all our trim. We'll just go ahead and start with the rear lower finisher. And all I'm going to do is get it in place and then press on it so it snaps right back in. And give it a little light punch here and there. Yep, feels pretty good. We want to make sure we get the gasket back in place. Now let's go ahead and install our rear kick plate. Same thing, all you got to do is get it in place and get a nice few slaps. And yep, there we go. Go ahead and do the same thing with the front kick plate as well. We'll go ahead and line that up with all the tabs and all the clips. And make sure everything's perfectly in place. Yeah, it feels pretty good. Give it a few slaps. And that looks pretty good. So doing a nice little quick inspection. Okay, it looks like we're so far so good. Yep, nothing sticking out. So now let's go ahead and install our rear panel. Same thing, all we got to do is get that in place and make sure everything lines up. So we'll get the seat belts out of the way, that's very critical. And there we go. And same thing, we'll go ahead and slap everything back into place until everything snaps. Now let's go ahead and install our push pin Christmas trees and also install our headrest guides. Now as you can see, I'm basically turning this as I'm putting it back in. And there we go. Now it should be a few turns. There we go. Do the same thing with the other side. Very nice. And we'll repeat the exact same thing on the driver's side as well. Put those Christmas tree push pins back in, all four. And then we'll go ahead and start twisting in our headrest guides. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and install our jack and basically our tire iron. And while we're on a roll, let's go ahead and install our jack storage cover. So let's go ahead and reinstall that string at the very bottom. Go ahead and line everything up. Make sure it's nice and slapped in place and go ahead and lock it in. And while we're at it, we'll go ahead and install our headrest as well as our child seat anchor cover. So that basically slaps right in. Nice. And the headrest slides right down. So now we can go ahead and throw in our seat back assembly. So get that in place. Line up the holes and slide downward. That feels pretty good. Now let's go ahead and install that one bolt. But first we're going to add a little bit of thread locking compound. This is blue, so that's going to be medium strength. So we'll be able to get it off later if need be. And we'll go ahead and start snugging it up with our 10mm socket and socket wrench. And that feels pretty good. So now let's go ahead and torque it down to 78 inch-pounds. Doesn't require much. And that felt pretty good. And now let's go ahead and install our seat cushion assembly. So we'll get that in place. Take those same two bolts from earlier and go ahead and apply a nice thin layer of thread locking compound. Same blue stuff. We'll start by hand threading both of them. And that feels pretty good. Take our 14mm socket wrench, snug them up. Now let's go ahead and torque it down to 33 foot-pounds. And I need a deep well socket. So there's one beep, and we'll go to the next one. And that felt pretty good. And we'll go ahead and repeat the exact same steps on the driver's side. I'm going to put my Velcro in place for the same reason, because these things fall over. Now let's go ahead and install the seat base trim panels. Same thing, we're going to slap those in. Okay, that looks pretty good. Go back to the passenger side and do the same thing. So now that we have the interior all put back together, let's go ahead and feed the rest of this cable through that loom. And I went ahead and fed it through as much as I could. It looks like we have about, I don't know, 15 feet's worth. And we have a little bit sticking out the end, which is good, with a little bit of extra loom. Now I'll go ahead and throw that under the vehicle for now. And before I continue running the cables, I do need to prep the wiring harness. Now this harness was made for a trailer hitch or a trailer setup. Now I'm not going to use this for the trailer, but I want to use the same connections. Now this one does have 4 wires coming out of it. It's basically running lights, turn signals, and your ground. Unfortunately, I only need 2 of these wires, and I basically need to move one of these 4. So we have that one right in the middle right there, and that's the reverse, which there's not a wire available, so we're going to have to move one of these pins. And I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. So what we're going to do is we take our little pick set up here, take out that little orange connection or that little orange plastic piece in the middle, set that aside, and I'll see if I can zoom in and focus. So right there, there's basically a little tab or a little locking clip that's holding these pins in. So once you get your pick under it, it's basically unlatching it, and then you pull the wire out. And I'll show you. So I got my pick in there, and now I pulled my wire straight out. I went ahead and start with the brown cable first, with the brown wire. We'll repeat the same one on the other one as well, yellow, and the last one will be green. And that pulled right out. Now the white we're going to leave in place because that's our ground. Now I'll go ahead and take off that little installation there because we're going to reuse that. Now I went ahead and picked brown just because that was convenient. I'm going to put that in the reverse camera spot. And that should click right in. Yeah, that feels really good. That looks pretty good as well. Looks very nice. And I'll go ahead and take that one little plunger or plug, and I'll go ahead and put that in one of the empty holes. Now let's go ahead and reinstall that orange plastic cover. And same thing, line it up, and it should push right in. And there we go. So now let me go ahead and work my way under the vehicle, so then we can go ahead and test this to make sure it works. So right under the rear bumper, or right behind it, we're going to see 2 trailer connections that are capped off, one black and one gray. So I'm going to take my needle nose pliers and go ahead and take off that one cap. And pretty much that's there just to keep water out of there, just to preserve all the pins. So we'll go ahead and set that aside. I'm trying to hold the camera steady, so bear with me. So now let's go ahead and hook in our new connection. This is the one we made inside. And all we're going to do is test it. So we're going to go in the vehicle, put the truck in reverse. Yep, we got 14 volts. That's a great sign. Put it back in park. Yep, 0 volts. So now that we know we pinned it correctly, let's go ahead and get rid of these excess wires. So right now we have the, let's see, the green and the yellow. I'll go ahead and cut those ends off. And I don't need this trailer connection or this 4-way connection at the very end. So go ahead and take that off as well. Let's go ahead and take off that green and yellow wire. And I want to keep the loom because I like that protective cover. And this is what we end up with. So far, it looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and take that same sealant from earlier, and let's go ahead and fill in those extra holes that aren't going to use them. Again, we want to try to keep this as waterproof so we can preserve the pins. I'm going to put a nice little hefty amount on those holes. And see about just smearing it around, and then go ahead and clean off the edges. We don't want to make sure we get it anywhere on the latching area. Now we'll go ahead and set that aside and let that dry out. So now let's go ahead and work our way under the vehicle so we can go ahead and run that camera cable. Now I'm basically going to start from where we fed under the hole, and then I'm going to go along the driver's side of the frame. Basically, I'm going to try to meet this up with their existing cable or existing wiring. So you're going to see a loom that I'm going to basically zip tie this next to. And that loom is the one that controls your brake lights and your turn signals. And that's this stuff right here. So I'm going to go basically take a few zip ties and just zip tie it along it. And once it's secure, we'll take our wire cutting tools and go ahead and trim off the excess. Make it nice and pretty. So there's 2 and 3. Now I'll continue the same process, working my way past the charcoal canister. Same thing, zip tying as we go. Now we're behind the rear shock, and then right at the rear bumper. And that looks pretty good so far. Now let's go ahead and hook in our new trailer connection, or trailer harness. Very nice. And same thing, we want to secure this, so we're going to take our black zip ties and go ahead and zip tie it along all the loom that's there now. And I'd like to give it a little extra slack. I don't want to put too much tension on any of our cables. That looks pretty good. So now let's connect all the harnesses and cables up. And we're going to go ahead and start with the reverse light connection that's on the camera side. This is basically the red and black wire that came with the camera. And of course, we'll go ahead and strip the ends off. And as an extra layer of protection, I am going to add some heat shrink tubing to this particular connection. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and throw it down this particular wiring. There we go. And then let's go ahead and crimp on some connectors. And let's see if I can get it in there. Alright, so there's one right there. Do a little pull. Same thing on the positive side. Feels pretty good. Now, if you want, you can use butt connectors, but I went ahead and use quick disconnects just in case I have to do troubleshooting later on. And we'll go ahead and make sure those are nice and snug and connected. Okay, it looks pretty good. And let's go ahead and plug in our camera. Very nice. Now let's go ahead and remove our license plate so we can install our camera. And of course, we're going to take our 3/8 socket and socket wrench. Take our 2 screws off. I'll go ahead and put my license plate down. Now I went ahead and ordered an additional bracket. This is a universal bracket that works with this camera, and it works perfectly, and I'll show you how. So right on the back of this camera, it has the exact same mount. It works out perfectly, the exact same holes and everything. So all we're going to need is a mini Phillips screwdriver. Take off those 2 mini screws, hopefully without dropping them. Alright, so now we just have the camera by itself. We took off that little bracket that came with it, and we're going to use this new aftermarket bracket. And we'll go ahead and line up the holes. Go ahead and screw in those 2 screws that came out of it. And that looks pretty good. That looks exactly what I want. And we're also going to install 2 rubber washers that came with it. So we're basically going to sandwich the bracket. And once we do that, let's go ahead and reinstall our license plate with the bracket as one piece. Now, just as FYI, all the products I'm using are going to be in the description below. So if you want to use any of them, just click on the links. So now let's go ahead and snug up our license plate. Looks pretty good. Now let's go for a test run. Let's make sure it works. Put it in reverse. And that looks really nice. Actually, it's really clear footage. So that's a good, successful test. Let's go and turn off the truck, and now let's go and finish buttoning up all the connections. So we have these 2 connections right here for the reverse lights. Let's go and put the heat shrink tubing over it. There we go. And ideally, you want to use a heat gun when shrinking this tubing. However, I didn't have one in range, so I'm just using a spoon cooker, and we're just going to go ahead and heat it up. The whole idea is I want to make this connection as waterproof as possible. So if you're wondering why I'm doing this extra mile, that's why. And that looks like it's pretty good. So now let's go ahead and put all that wiring back in the loom. And we want to make sure we get any that are exposed. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and roll up the excess slack. That way we have good, clean cable management. Now the reason this area is a little bit long, that's just because that's what came with the radio, and I couldn't really splice that connection. So we're just going to go ahead and roll it up in this one little area. Take our zip ties, and we'll go ahead and secure it down. Looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and cut off all the excess with our wire cutters. And that came out looking pretty good. And just to show you a little bit of overview of how we ran it under the truck, we're going to start with the rear of the bumper. And obviously you can see this one little area, and then we have our 2 connections where our trailer harness goes. And obviously we're going above the frame on the driver's side. So we went above the rear shock, and then above the charcoal canister, and then all the way to that hole to where we began. And it's pretty much that easy. And now we can get from under the vehicle and take a look at our final product. Looking at this, it came out looking really good. Doesn't look bad at all, and it's very sturdy. It looks like it blends in very nice with this rear bumper with the black trim. So overall, this was a complete success. Well, if you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe.